I don't know if you ever play video games, but I play a lot of them. And there's a certain kind of ethos that's in a lot of video games, particularly those games like Call of Duty and the first-person shooter games, that it's important to pay attention to. Because I feel like they really hit the spirit of the age. Or even games like Grand Theft Auto. These are big-selling video games, by the way. They're like Beyonce's. In those games, basically you're this fighter who everyone has betrayed. Like the US military betrays you, your family betrays you. Everyone is out to get you. And even your close military buddy or whoever. The storylines are always that ultimately everyone's screwing you. Certainly it is a safe position for a video game because it's safe across the entire ideological spectrum. But I also think it pinpoints a certain kind of mood of the era. Anti-establishment runs deep across so many currents. And everyone's got their idea of who the man is. And, you look at even like a Coca-Cola ad, and they'll encourage you to go in your cubicle and throw out your papers and get out there and just be free. So even like corporate America is encouraging us to fight the man. Do you remember those old ads? And it was like the dweebish PC computer guy. And then the Mac guy was like this kind of Red Hot Chili Peppers hipster kid. And he's like, hey, and he's the individual and it's freedom. But I think even then, even the spirit of anti-establishment gets into the establishment. Just to say, because even these big video games like Call of Duty, they're mega industries. They're not like some scrappy anti-establishment thing. I mean, they've got people that work on it the size of major films like Jurassic Park. I mean, big money. But everyone's anti-establishment. And certainly the mood in this country is deeply anti-establishment.
Oh, well, that was pretty interesting. Yeah, because of course that anti-establishment thing we are talking about individualism. We are talking about, the very dominant narrative that we have in America, which is, the individual versus society and all of society, with the individual, of course, being the good guy and all of society being bad. But his point that this is a corporate product is very well taken. And in fact, of course, if we think about where this narrative came from, this narrative is very much a product of the Cold War. I mean, I'm not saying it began with the Cold War, but the answer is, if we were to kind of track, like, well, how many people thought this was an important narrative to them? We don't have such a graph, but I think that if we did, we would see a very sharp upward turn during the Cold War. And so the answer is, our idea that we stand against evil, and that's an original stance. You know what I mean? That's a stance which has to do with our nature, is actually the product of U.S. propaganda. I think that as the U.S. became more and more embroiled, with the Soviet Union, our way of differentiating ourselves was to generate these two narratives. We were Jackson Pollock. They were robots.
Right.
And the government very actively promoted that. So meaning that, they were in there, they were promoting art shows that, that featured people like Jackson Pollock, the other abstract expressionists. They were actually supporting even, literary magazines,
right. Right.
where this kind of narrative was being advanced. And they were literally buying up 50% of the run of certain literary journals in order to keep them afloat. And sure enough, their propaganda efforts paid off. The efforts were mostly international, but they were domestic as well. So that in order to fight with the Soviet Union, not only did we have to convince other nations in the world that the Soviet Union, were these evil collectivists. And that is, by the way, one of the reasons I avoid the word collectivism in my book, as best I can, is because, the political overtones are just overwhelming. Collectivism is bad. But the answer is that they promoted it abroad, but they had to promote it domestically as well. So, what this guy NATO is saying is a corporate product. Before that, it was, is simply U.S. propaganda.
Right.
And we've all bought it. We've bought our own propaganda, and we're now buying this corporate product that he's absolutely right. That's enabling us to feel great and kind of powerful as we sit there at the video game, through which they are making a very handsome profit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's ironic. Yeah. I mean, like there's obvious irony in an enormous corporate, enormous businesses built on the idea that you are a rugged individualist against the machine.
Exactly.
But,
exactly.
While all that, I can see the obvious truth in what you're saying. I mean, I also think back to the beginning of America, right? I mean, like it is a foundational idea of this country that we don't want to be ruled.
Right.
I mean, that essentially we want individual freedom. We want, and then of course the founding fathers argued over what exactly that might mean. But, we overthrew a tyrant. So there was that.
Well, it's one thing to be free of a tyrant. And it's another thing to imagine that you can live without society.
Sure.
That's a kind of turn we made with people like Emerson and Thoreau,
Right.
There's a difference between not wanting to be taxed without representation, right? That still assumes that there's a government there and you might not like the rules, under which you are being subjugated, but that's not to say you reject the idea of government altogether. And there's a big difference between that and kind of, a more anarchist view, which is that, we don't want any government or, I'm not saying that Emerson and Thoreau thought that, but I think that some of the ideas that we have now that your expert Nato was talking about in his tape are that, when he sort of says like, all guys are bad guys, like it's the individual versus everyone and all society.
Right.
He's sort of saying like, this is an amazing level of individualism. And I would have to agree. It's one thing to stand up and sort of say, basically, this is not fair. That's one thing.
That's right.
Like it's your aim is to generate some new form of social order based on rules that are fair. Well, that's one thing. It's another thing to say, wow, it is me against everyone and me against all social order. I'm thinking like, wow, first of all, it's very sad. Very, very sad. And also it's a fantasy because we are just not evolved, to live by ourselves, with no other people and not to be able to trust anyone else is just really a tragic thing.